Good morning, everyone. My name is Erik de Peut. I will be your panel leader today. We are now in panel 5.2. We will discuss about the role of municipalities as pathmaker for sustainability. Let's first introduce myself. I work in Belgium for the Association of Flemish Cities and Municipalities, and I work on climate and energy. So the topic of today is very interesting for everyone who's working with cities and communities. Next to me, I introduce you Markus Fritz from Fraunhofer, Germany, who is my co-assistant leading this panel. This morning we will have 4 interesting topics. We will start in Oxford. The topic from Paula Hansen. She is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Oxford. Her topic tells first things first, laying the foundations of smart energy communities by exploring concepts and realities in European case studies. Paula Hansen, you have the floor.
Hi everybody, my name is Paula and I am presenting a paper that I wrote together with my colleagues Jake Barnes and Sarah Darby. We are based at the Environmental Change Institute at the University of Oxford, and we are currently working on a Horizon 2020 project called Newcomers. And this paper explores the concept of smart energy communities. So the starting point for this paper was the observation that the term or concept of smart has become ubiquitous in the realm of energy systems research, but it's not always clear what it means. And it's also starting to appear more and more in the context of energy communities. And we use a very broad definition of energy communities here. And we understand energy communities to typically be characterized by participatory processes, collective outcomes, environmental and social, as opposed to more financial motivations, involvement of citizens, and the associations of different actors working together. And we were interested in the interface of these two phenomena. So we asked what smart means in the context of energy communities. And to answer that question, we conducted a rapid review of literature, and then we examined 6 case study communities based on the findings. And so this exercise was very much exploratory, with the idea being to get a better understanding of the lay of the land. So I'm going to talk very briefly about the rapid review and the results of that, and then I'll talk about case study application, and then finish by outlining some of the overarching findings. So just to start with, just in case you haven't come across rapid reviews before, rapid reviews are basically very shorter and quicker versions of systematic reviews. And they're generally understood as knowledge syntheses or evidence summaries that are conducted in a shorter time frame, and are meant to serve as, for example, as a scoping mechanism for deciding when a full review may be needed. And they usually employ streamlined or modified methods to speed up the process. And yeah, we conducted one with the question of how researchers have defined and used the term smart in the context of energy communities. So I'm not going to talk about this in any more detail because I've got a lot more stuff to get through, but I've put the search string that we've used there. And our first kind of restricting criterion was to use only Scopus as a database. And the initial search yielded 726 results, and we narrowed that down to 30. So yeah, so that's the set of papers that we then worked with. So just to run you through some of the main findings, I think an important finding is that there is no common definition of smartness. There are a lot of different interpretations and a lot of different terms. Most commonly, they were used as compound terms. So smart grid, I think, was the most common one. Smart microgrid, smart consumer, etc. And there also seemed to be like a nested hierarchy in the way terms were used. So, for example, smart microgrids are smaller at a smaller scale than smart districts, perhaps, and then smart cities. Smartness was also generally not the core kind of focus of papers, but part of a more general framing. And definitions where they were given were usually very implicit, and most commonly they refer to the use of information communication technology. And also implicitly, we found that ICT was what was usually meant was digital ICT. So people weren't talking about using a telephone, but they're talking about digital ICT applications. The review also indicated that there may be differing degrees of sophistication. So this was indicated, for example, by the term intelligent, where some authors seem to use that as synonymous with smart, and others seem to differentiate between the two, with intelligent meaning automated, using artificial intelligence or machine learning. We also found that there is a social component to a social dimension to smartness. For example, the way technology is used obviously is based on what humans do, and whether a system works overall may also depend not just on technology but also on humans. In terms of community, we found 4 main kind of mobilizations of community that were used, and those were of place, scale, interest, or as an actor, where scale means the scale of infrastructure, and actor meaning that the technology seemed to give communities more agency to become a more powerful actor in the energy system, basically. And then lastly, we also found that smartness seems to differ depending on what kind of understanding of community is used, but how exactly wasn't clear from the review. So we posed 3 questions to then apply to the case studies. And these were: what types of ICT do the communities use? What functions does the technology have? And is there a link between the mobilization of community and smartness? And what might it be? So I've listed the case studies here. I can't explain all of them, but there are 6 cases based in 5 different countries, and they vary a lot in terms of their motivations and ways of operating. So just to give you an example, the Jana case is a community in an apartment building, whereas Power Zone, for example, uses peer-to-peer trading based on blockchain technology. The Silent community is a completely virtual community spread all across Germany. And we've analyzed all of these as part of the Horizon 2020 Newcomers project that I've mentioned before. So what we found was, first of all, that all of the communities use ICT to some extent. So there is a baseline sort of where, for example, they use websites for communication purposes or accounting. And then secondly, there's a wide variety, again, of technologies that they used, from metering technology to web portals and apps and platforms. And we identified three main functions that this technology has in the case studies, and those are monitoring, operation, and engagement. So by monitoring, we mean just basic monitoring purposes. So for example, in Jenny Jesenica, there's a licensed supplier that uses smart meters just to kind of better understand self-consumption. And that's different from how, for example, N uses a social algorithm to kind of to do what they set out to do, which is to equitably allocate and distribute renewable energy within an apartment building, taking into consideration the socioeconomic background of its residents. So it really is about the core functionality of this community. And then engagement is about engaging consumers or engaging community members, for example, through consumer access devices showing real-time generation and consumption within the community. Right, so I'm going to highlight some of our main takeaways from the exercise. First of all, smart and community are both extremely ambiguous terms, which was a bit of a challenge. Generally, there is a lot of vagueness around how smart the term is used. However, it is most commonly associated with the use of digital ICT. Again, there's a lack of specificity in how it is talked about and described. So, for example, what's the difference between smart tech and other tech? What's the difference between smart and intelligent? That's not made explicit. And digital ICT is everywhere. It's often it's become so embedded in our practices that it's not considered smart anymore, such as using software to calculate bills or websites for communication. So that means that smart is relative. It depends on what you're already using or used to. Then there is a wide variety of technologies that are used for a wide variety for different reasons. For example, monitoring, operation, and engagement. These technologies also may vary by degree of sophistication, and we might think about that in terms of type. So there are analog devices on one end of the spectrum, and then machine learning applications at the other. Or we might think about it in terms of function, so from basic monitoring to core functionality. And then lastly, we kind of, based on what we found, we propose that perhaps a better way to think about smartness then is to think about it as a characteristic of socio-technical configurations. So if all energy communities use some ICT anyway, then the smart label in just like the technological sense is pretty futile. It's different from just a smart technology. It's more about how the technology used, not the technology as such. So that emphasizes, thinking about it in this way, emphasizes the need for specificity and positions smartness as a relative concept that is dependent on technology and humans. So smart is more similar in that sense to innovative. And it's influenced by the type and function of technology, as well as the chosen mobilization of community. Right, so to sum up, this paper is basically a first step towards better understanding of smartness in the context of energy communities. The review was somewhat complicated by the ambiguity of the terms. So an obvious suggestion would be to perhaps conduct a more comprehensive systematic review in the future. And we see a couple of possible areas of future research, including how different mobilizations of community influence smartness. For example, if there might be a link between how sophisticated the technology is and the kind of actors that are involved in the community, as well as an in-depth analysis of the specific types and functions that are used. And one question that we think may be interesting to consider in the future is whether or not some communities are actually smarter than others. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paula, for this paper. First, I will address to all attendees of this panel. You can ask your questions in WOVA in the chat, please. This is the moment to ask a question to the speakers of this panel, so have them asked. So I think, Paula, there's a first question for you. Is it worth trying to define smart, or perhaps provide a hierarchy map of smart can mean, so that people can identify vague uses more easily?
Yes to the second part of the question. So I think one of our kind of takeaways is that it's not easy to define smart as just one particular thing or one as a concrete concept, but I think it is possible to identify different categories or different types, perhaps, and that I think would be very useful. Yeah, okay. So we haven't, the paper doesn't come up with like a finished framework or hierarchy or map, whatever you want to call it, but I do think that that would be a useful next step.
Okay, thank you. I also have a question from myself to you. Can smartness accelerate the pathway to a climate neutral city? And what, in your opinion, Paula, is needed for cities to come to real action?
I think my answer to that is informed by socio-technical thinking. I think whether technology, the extent to which technology can help accelerate the transition depends on how well it is used. I think that's my short answer. Sorry, what was the second bit?
Marcus, do you have questions for Paula?
No further questions from the chat, but maybe you can say a little bit more, because I think this is an interesting part. So the question, how much smartness is needed to achieve sustainability in cities? So what do you think about that?
I'm not sure. I do think we need digital ICT. But yeah, it depends on how it is used and how well it is used. I think, from having done the review, the impression that I got was that this idea of socio-technical systems and of people using the technologies gets a bit lost sometimes when we're talking about smart technologies. So yeah, I got the impression that that idea is fairly well established in a lot of the kind of energy social sciences, but it hasn't entirely been applied to or recognized in the context of smart technologies or digital ICT. So I think there is still some potential to gain a better understanding of how people, communities interact with digital ICT and what that means for overall system functioning.
So you mean that smart people are more important than smart technologies?
Yes.
Okay.
Exactly. Ultimately, yes.
That's a very nice conclusion. Thank you, Smart Paula Hansen. For the next topic, we will stay in Oxford. We have Sam Hampton from the Energy Group of the University of Oxford. He has his paper about pathways to lead Oxfordshire to zero carbon society. Sam, the floor is yours.
Hello, my name is Sam Hampton and I'm a researcher at the University of Oxford in the Environmental Change Institute. And I'm going to tell you about a project I've been working on with some colleagues at Oxford, but also from a charity called Bioregional. The project's actually being funded by 12 separate local authorities and other stakeholders in the county, and they were all keen to find out different ways in which Oxfordshire can eradicate carbon emissions from its economy. To provide an outline to my talk, I'll start with a bit of Oxfordshire context and then describe some background to this project before going on to talk about where we've got to so far in climate action and decarbonisation in the county. And then I'll talk about the project, what we did in terms of developing scenarios and different pathways to achieving zero carbon, and end with some thoughts and reflections on the process. Okay, so Oxfordshire is a rural county in the centre of England, about 100 kilometres away from London. It's primarily a rural county. Obviously, Oxford City is at the centre of the county, and Oxford City is not a huge city. It's only about 150,000 people, so it's actually most of the population lives outside in the rural county, and obviously we have a very strong knowledge-based economy with a kind of world-famous university, but we also have a very strong low-carbon sector and a second university which is in the top 20 universities in the UK. So it's with all of that, there's quite an educated population with the knowledge-based economy, and average incomes are slightly higher than the UK average. But that said, there are some real areas of poverty and deprivation, particularly some suburbs of Oxford City. And another thing that's worth saying is that there are some political divisions within the county. The city has long been governed by a left-leaning Labour council, whereas the wider county tends to lean a bit further to the right, and various attempts have been made to kind of to collapse what we call a two-tier local authority system, which many counties in England have done to kind of drive efficiencies and things like that. But because of those political differences, we retain a higher level county council, and then 4 district councils and 1 city council. Okay. And in the last few years, I mean, I think this is a trend that's happening across the world, but local authorities in the UK have been particularly proactive when it comes to climate change. And I think it's now 300 local authorities out of about 480 have declared climate emergencies. And having done that, they're all beginning to think, what do we do about that? How do we create policies and strategies to respond to those declarations? And so many are now declaring net zero targets and putting in place plans to meet them. And so firstly, they have been focusing on their own operations, and as a rule of thumb, local authority direct emissions represent between about 2 and 5% of total emissions for the area. So it's not insignificant, but they're also very influential on the wider economy. So they've been setting these kind of aspirational targets to achieve a zero carbon economy across the whole territory. And they've been going for different dates for doing so. So for their own operations, most of them think they can do that in the next decade, as you can see in the middle column here. And then for the wider area, there's a balance here, because the UK has a 2050 net zero goal. And so some have just stuck with that, recognizing that, that their local authorities can only control so much, and they rely on national frameworks and policies for so many things. So the County Council have got a 2050 goal, as does West Oxfordshire District Council. But others have tried to be much more ambitious. So Oxford City Council have declared a target of 2040, and Charwell and South Oxfordshire, which are quite rural districts, have got a very aspirational target of 2030, and are thinking, what can we do to really be leading the way. Okay, so just to provide a bit of background to our report, this is actually building on something that was written back in 2014 by colleagues at the Environmental Change Institute that has had quite a bit of impact. Some of these figures have been influential locally, but also got cited by the UK government's clean growth strategy. So this idea that the low carbon sector at the time represented 7% of the local economy, employed nearly 9,000 people, and had significant growth potential. And there was a bit of limited scenario modelling included in that report, based on the idea that in different A, B and C scenarios, you would see more ambitious climate action correlated with growth ambitions. And when I talk about growth here, I'm saying that there are some quite ambitious and advanced plans for significant housing development in the county. There's been a target of 100,000 new homes, and that's based on a baseline of about 250. So quite significant housing growth was forecast at that time, and actually we're seeing that come to fruition now. Okay, so moving on to progress that we've made since, over the last 10 years, we used different baselines depending on what we could find data for. But over the last 10 years in Oxfordshire, we've seen a 27% emissions reduction. And that actually means the county is on track to achieve a 50% reduction target that the local authorities set for themselves by 2030. And that's based on a 2008 baseline. One of the success stories has been local solar generation, which represents 3% of the national solar fleet, which is more than the share of the population. So the population of Oxfordshire is about 1% of the UK total. So we're doing quite well with solar. But other issues have made other areas of the economy have made slower progress. So transport emissions remain very high, and heat decarbonisation is really not going very well. There are only really a handful of heat pump installations or biomass installations, and most of the county's homes still rely on gas, about 80%, and those in the rural areas off gas grid will rely on heating oil, or in some cases direct electric heating. So yeah, most of this reduction has been driven by the decarbonisation of the national electricity grid, but also some energy efficiency measures to do with appliances and that kind of thing. And here's a graph that really shows some of that. So this idea of decoupling emissions from GDP has got a lot of attention in recent years, and this really shows that we've done that in the UK and in Oxfordshire. So Oxfordshire's GDP, as you can see with the green lines, has gone slightly faster than the UK, and pretty good growth we've seen since the financial recession. And population so far has been about in line with the UK population growth, 5%, but that is going to accelerate as these new houses are built. And as you can see, emissions have been going down, as I say, mainly driven by decarbonisation of electricity and energy efficiency measures. Okay, so in the report, what we did was to adapt some existing modelling for achieving zero carbon that's been conducted by the National Grid at the UK level, and adapt that to Oxfordshire's specific context. And we came up with 4 different scenarios, which I'm going to go through quite rapidly now. So the first scenario is called steady progression, which is essentially a business as usual scenario, but it recognises that actually things are changing at the national level. We are seeing new policy announcement and investment. So it extrapolates from existing trends and already announced policies, but it doesn't see huge ambition, and it doesn't reach, crucially, it doesn't reach zero carbon by 2050. So here we see low levels of energy efficiency in buildings, continued reliance on fossil fuels for heating and for private transport. We do see a transition to electric vehicles, but it's a bit slower, and natural gas is used for heating well into the 2040s. Our second one is called societal transformation, and here we see a real change in individual behaviour change and attitudes, and consumers making environmentally conscious decisions. So we see a strong take-up of domestic energy efficiency measures, widespread installation of heat pumps, and in this one we see a lot of rooftop solar as well as some ground-mounted solar installed in Oxfordshire. The uptake of electric vehicles is really rapid, but we also see a real growth in active modes of transport and the use of public travel too. And here, because of the electrification of transport and heat, we see electricity demand rising really dramatically. I think it's roughly doubling based on 2020 levels. And so we also see high levels of flexibility driven by user behavior, so things like vehicle to grid technology and other time of use demand shifting. And we see here a widespread adoption of low meat diets, and that allows us to reallocate some of our agricultural land to double woodland and to restore natural ecosystems. And this is one of our 3 scenarios that does achieve zero carbon by 2050. The second is, in contrast, a very techno-optimistic scenario. Rather than see substantial attitude and behaviour changes amongst the population, here the change is driven by technology. So we see fewer heat pumps installed, and existing gas boilers are replaced with hydrogen boilers from about 2035 onwards. And there's a preference for ground-mounted solar as opposed to rooftop. There's a bit less user-driven flexibility, although electricity demand-side flexibility is still present, but kind of automated wherever possible. And here we see a reliance on private vehicles, so lots of EVs adopted. And on land, we see intensified agriculture and high levels of bioenergy production for use in CCS plants, which we think won't probably be built in Oxfordshire, but Oxfordshire does need to contribute to the bioenergy that is burnt elsewhere. And this is another scenario that achieves zero carbon. Our final one is kind of combines the best bits from the others, or at least the most ambitious. So it sees strong public and local policy support. Solar capacity, for instance, increases by 10 times today's levels and represents 6% of the national total solar fleet. We see a real deployment of heat pumps, lots of flexibility from users' behaviour, and besides the electrification of private vehicles, we see a lot more active travel and low traffic neighbourhoods, and also in the widespread use of shared modes of mobility. Here, land is freed up again by low meat diets, meaning we can allocate much more land to solar, but also bioenergy production, and it achieves zero carbon at least by 2050, if not before. Certainly it's possible to given some of this this ambition, to achieve it by 2045 here. So I've described at least 3 different ways in which Oxfordshire can eradicate carbon emissions from its economy by 2050. But there are some real commonalities here that are worth drawing out. So each of the 3 scenarios involve the rapid deployment of solar photovoltaics on rooftops and in fields. But we also need to see a major program of retrofit for our existing building stock, as well as stepping up our ambitions for energy efficiency standards and solar generation on new homes and other developments. Each of these scenarios involves a substantial increase in energy demand, electricity demand, and that's going to need significant investment in the grid, and also the widespread use of flexible practices on the demand side. Each of the scenarios will require the rapid phase out of gas boilers and also fossil fuel modes of transport in the next 10 to 15 years. And we need to see innovation in food production, and we're going to see more growth of bioenergy. And finally, we need to see more restoration of ecosystems and enhancement of natural capital. So just to finish with some thoughts and reflections, it's been brilliant to see in the last couple of years how local stakeholders, including all the local authorities, are taking climate change very seriously. They clearly see an opportunity for the economy, the knowledge-based economy, to drive the transition, and for us to see economic growth on the back of that. It's interesting to observe that local areas are really competing to be seen as climate leaders. I think some of that is in anticipation of COP26, which is going to be based in the UK this year. But where that competition can drive ambition, we also need to see more collaboration and recognition that that we need national government to drive action here as well. It's been obvious that some of that target setting, by saying we're going to achieve this 20 years before the national target, is probably quite unrealistic, but actually recognizing that it's a message, it sends a real powerful message, and that should be acknowledged, that Oxfordshire is saying to government, we want to do this much earlier than current national legislation requires. And finally, you can read the paper for more detailed conclusions, but it's clear that with the COVID recovery and all the investment made by the state, but also businesses, it's essential that climate action is linked with that. Okay, so thank you very much for your time. A bit over 15 minutes, apologies for that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sam. I think this paper is very interesting because it's leading the goals for a whole region, not only the city, but the whole region. And I think there are some advantages to have the whole region in scope. The rural regions, you have more opportunities for wind, for biomass, and so on. And in the city, you have more opportunities for solar energy, for flexibility, for shared electric cars, and so on. Do you use this whole region as an advantage, Sam?
Yeah, absolutely. If it was only the city we were looking at, then, as you say, we wouldn't have so much opportunity to generate renewables. Whereas as a rural county, we have the opportunity to install a lot of solar, which it has happened. There was a bit of a pause from, say, the last 5 years when the economics of solar has not been very, very good, but it's really picking up again, and we're seeing lots of plans from some really big solar farms coming. So yeah, absolutely. One question that we really grappled with was kind of how much of local demand we ideally would generate ourselves. Obviously, the UK is kind of got a big advantage when it comes to wind and offshore wind, and that we've seen so much progress there. But Oxfordshire, for various reasons, is not the best place for wind. That we've got several kind of areas of outstanding natural beauty, which makes it very difficult, and the planning system has all but made it impossible in recent years to install new wind turbines. So it's not going to be 100% is what we came up with. And so we kind of, yeah, it's a debate as to how much of local demand should be met by local generation. And the most ambitious Oxfordshire leading the way scenario that I described has about 55% for that figure. But yeah, there's lots of trade-offs, and definitely I think you're right, looking at it as a city region is a really helpful perspective.
So Sam, we have a lot of questions for you. Thank you everyone for posing questions. You can still pose your questions at the chat. One detailed question for you, Sam. Is there a legal regulation of the phase out of gas boilers? And can you maybe provide it? And in general, how to address homeowners to go for retrofit and change of heating system? How do you do it?
So yeah, so there is a regulation for new build homes in the UK. From 2025, you won't be able to install a new gas boiler, which is too late. But anyway, and I don't know the situation. I think they haven't yet announced what the date will be when you can't replace a gas boiler in an existing property with another one. I think it's a bit later, 2030 or a bit further out. So that's really got to be very important. One important thing to consider when thinking about low carbon heating systems in the UK is that the building stock is not very efficient in general, particularly by European standards. So there are many properties in the UK that would not be appropriate for a heat pump just to be installed as is without some substantial building fabric energy efficiency measures. So a really big challenge in the UK for decarbonising heat.
Mm-hmm. In the same situation, in your you talked about hydrogen for heating houses. Don't you think hydrogen is too valuable for heating the houses?
Yeah, it's a good point. Absolutely, I've seen some really interesting work recently showing how many uses there are for hydrogen, and heating for homes comes quite low down that. No, we don't think it's an optimal solution. That scenario is useful as a counterpoint almost to kind of illustrate the importance of the other solutions, and I think it's important the fact that it comes in so late, kind of from only small amounts of hydrogen from 2035, because it's, as you say, it's not very, as you're implying, it's not very efficient, but also green and blue hydrogen, the kind of technologies are not scaled up at the moment. So lots of problems with hydrogen, and yeah, we put that in as a kind of good counterfactual for what else needs to happen, I think.
I see here a very short but very interesting question. How important is local support in achieving national decarbonization targets? In my opinion, I think cities and communities almost provide in achieving the national goals. So cities and communities should be paid by national government for their work. But what's your opinion there?
Absolutely, and this is what I was trying to get at about with these setting targets that are so far ahead of the national, because for a rural district in Oxfordshire to say it wants to achieve net zero by 2030, 20 years ahead of the national government is slightly mad, because we rely on national policy to ban the use of fossil fuels in vehicles and to ban gas boilers, and that kind of thing just cannot be done at a local level with the current levels of devolution that we have. But I think the point is, it's a political statement, it's a statement of will, and it's saying, look, the people of Oxfordshire have voted in for local government officials who think we should be going much further. So it sends a message. So I think that local support is really, really key. It gets difficult when you actually try and kind of talk about the practicalities, because actually it's like you can't do that much. But yeah, there's a lot of politics here, and I think that kind of local support is key. And I see the question above about community groups as well. And there's a reference to low carbon West Oxford. And I think individuals can be really important, and even really small community groups like that. And I think Oxfordshire, we've seen a lot of strength. It's really strong community groups come together, and we have a network called the Community Action Group Network. One real thing that we have seen a big success here is kind of local community funded solar, and in one case a wind farm, and also kind of solar on schools and energy efficiency measures. So there's an organization called Low Carbon Hub that's been able to leverage that kind of public support and actually get people to invest, and they get fairly good returns on their investment, and it's a real win-win. So yeah, the transition, there's a hell of a long way to go, let's be clear, but what we have seen has been driven by the very, very grassroots in the county.
Sam, I will pick one more question with a short answer of yours, and then I go to Marcus for the last question he can pick to ask you. The short question, with user flexibility in electricity, do you mean local peer-to-peer energy sharing between citizens, or another form of flexibility like batteries and so on, or do you mean both?
Primarily, we're talking about time shifting and battery storage, vehicle to grid technologies, and also just smart charging and smart fridges and all of those kinds of things that Paula knows about. Because what we're talking about is avoiding the very expensive upgrade of or trying to mitigate the costs of upgrading the local grid, which is constrained in various parts of the county. And we know that we will need to have millions of pounds of investment in the local distribution network, but flexibility plays a key part in kind of making sure that that bill is not too high.
Okay, thank you. Marcus, can you pick one last question for Sam?
Yeah, for sure. There are some other questions in the Q&A session, so maybe Sam, you can have a look at it and then you can answer it there. But maybe one thing that I'm also interested in, do you see a role for a municipality-owned solar installer to be created who could install systems? Do you think this is a good idea to lower the price?
Yeah, I mean, maybe. I don't know that much about the solar installer market, but I do know that there are lots of solar installers. So I don't know if there is necessarily a need for a council-owned company to do that. We have some pretty good firms in Oxfordshire. Some of them went under, unfortunately, when the feed-in tariff was so quickly shut down. But one thing I think that municipalities have a really important role is in fundraising, and there's a pension fund, for example, that is I think it's a national local authority pension fund, and they've recently said that they kind of have a climate objective in what they want to do with that investment. And so in our report, we actually kind of make a kind of high level recommendation that some of this money that's generated with that pension fund could be allocated to reinvesting locally. So there's so at the moment it goes anywhere and overseas and etc. So there's a kind of opportunity there. So we do cover that a little bit.
Okay, thank you so much, Sam. Thank you for your contribution. Unfortunately, we have to leave the UK, we have to leave Oxford, and we go right ahead to Italy, where we will meet Alessandro Sciullo. He is a researcher at the University of Turin, and he made a case study on Italy concerning county readiness for energy communities development. Alessandro, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Alessandro Sciullo from University of Torino, and I will present in the next few minutes an exercise that with some colleagues from the EQU project we carried out in the past month in order to assess the country readiness for the energy communities development. So with the outline, I will present in a very few seconds the EQU projects, and then we move to the ambition, objectives, activities, and main results of these assessment exercises. So what about EQU? EQU is a coordination support action funded by the Horizon 2020 program, and it started in 2020 and will last until 2023. The main ambition of EQU is to address a few challenges posed by the EU directives on renewables and energy market, the directive that have to be implemented by the end of this year, and that for the first time recognize two energy communities a formal juridical form. The problem is that these two types of energy communities might require people that would like to join an energy communities a bit of effort in terms of motivation and a bit of effort in terms of financial barriers. So EQU aims at overcoming, in a way, these challenges, these limits, going a bit beside and beyond the EU directives by proposing and implementing a kind of virtual community that would require to people just to sign a contract with an energy retailer and of course having a bit of IT infrastructure like a mobile phone. The idea is to create a virtual communities mediated by energy retailer that is the EU administrative entity in order for exchanging energy among prosumers and consumers. Say that, what are the premises and objectives of these assessment exercise? Well, the involvement of society at large, meaning stakeholders and the citizens, in the past year have gained a lot of relevance for the energy transition in order for improving the acceptance and the adoption of renewable-based technologies, innovative technologies, in order to grasp citizen needs and hopefully meet their expectation, and in such a way to provide more market-tailored products and services. In view of these challenges, the energy communities, or widening the scope, the collective action initiative in the energy field started to play quite a relevant role for the past 2 decades. And now that they have received a formal recognition of their relevance, time has come to try to assess the extent to which the countries, the European countries, are ready to implement the energy communities model. And this is why we decided to go for these assessment exercises that have 2 main objectives. One is to propose a first set of dimensions to assess the country readiness in view of energy communities implementation, and to test a first test of this assessment in the case of Italy. So coming back to what are energy communities, as an informal definition that might help in defining the boundaries of this organization is that by energy communities we can refer to any groups of citizens or juridical persons who voluntarily decide to associate to meet their energy needs through the collective production, consumption, and purchase of energy. So the main 2 words are voluntarily and collective. In terms of the formal definition coming from the EU directives 2018 and 2019, the European Union defined the main domain or aspects to be considered for an energy communities to be implemented. So governance, ownership and control, purpose, geographical scope, activities, participants, and effective control. Some of these domains are almost identical for the renewable energy communities and citizen energy community, while the other have some differences. The main differences are that in terms of geographical scope, the renewable energy communities have to be local, while the citizen energy communities don't need to be local. In terms of activities, the citizen energy communities have to produce only electricity, while the REC can produce also heating. And in terms of participants, the citizen energy communities might also have among their members large enterprises. In any case, not any of the members can have energy as the primary activity. Say that, what are the dimensions to be considered in order to assess the country readiness? Let's go back to the eceee model. The eceee model is a model promoted by citizens and social actors within a specific energy system in the context of a specific European national local regulatory framework. These are the three main elements that immediately drive to the needs of collect information on three dimensions: the socioeconomic and cultural profile, the energy system, the institutional landscape. The first, intended as a proxy for the country's social and not only social innovation potential. The second, the energy system, considered not only in terms of energy infrastructure, demand, production, but also in terms of the people that perform and live in the specific energy system. So to be considered also the citizen attitudes toward energy and sustainability. Finally, the institutional landscape is made up of legislation, policies, and administrative processes. Let's go to Italy. For what concerns the socioeconomic profile, in Italy we have the so-called three Italies, is an expression proposed 50 years ago by an Italian sociologist to describe the territorial gradient that characterize Italy, that characterize the country. From the north to the south, you can actually detect a decrease in almost all the social and economic indicators that pose the north center part of the country almost in line and often above the European Union average, while the south continues suffering a structural and historical gap for almost all the indicators. In particular, for what concerns the distribution of wealth, work, and employment, in the north, we have almost half of the country's enterprises and more than half of the workforce. In terms of education, Italy has a dramatic delay with respect to European Union. 40% of people have only primary education versus the 20% of people in European Union. Less than 20% of people have a tertiary education level against the more than 30%. Okay, so for what concern energy system, we can say how in 2019 Italy is still a country based for its electricity needs on fossil fuel with a high dependence from abroad. Less than 90% of the demand for electricity is met by domestic production, and more than 60% of the total energy produced is produced by thermoelectric plants. These thermoelectric plants are mostly fed by natural gas imported from abroad. So, to summarize, almost 50% of the electricity in Italy is produced through natural gas imported from abroad, plus 12% of electricity directly imported from abroad. This is quite a critical situation, with renewables in any case gaining a bit of relevance in the past year. We have also some problem in terms of overloading of the transmission lines coming from Switzerland, France, and along the Adriatic coast. More, let's say, positive is the landscape. If we look at past experience of society involvement in cooperative energy communities and collective action initiatives in general in the energy field. We have quite a long history in the northeastern part of the country, and we had a second wave of energy communities in the first decade of the 21st century, driven by the feed-in tariffs. At the moment, we can count on more than 100 organizational initiative that in some way can be referred to the energy communities model. So as for the institutional landscape, that is legislation, plus policies and administrative issue, Italy is quite surprisingly at the forefront for the EU directive transposition. We already have a transitory regulation from the 2020 for the renewables directive. We have some regions with specific discipline on the subject, and we have put a scheme for the transposition of the energy market directive within the draft law of the European delegation for the years 2019-2020. We have specific loans and regulation and guarantee schemes that merge PV incentive with tax credit for energy efficiency in buildings. We have the National Research Institute on Energy funding 9 pilot projects. We had implemented the first energy communities perfectly in line with the EU directive last month, close to Torino, and we can count on a strong cooperation between the Ministry for Economic Development and the National Authority for Energy Regulation in view of defining a context for energy communities implementation. Okay, so to conclude, here are the main results of this exercise in terms of strengths and limits that we detected for Italy and for the exercise in itself. As for the socioeconomic profile, we see how Italy is a heterogeneous country with a huge difference between the north-central part of the country and the south. And heterogeneity that should be, of course, taken into account when designing an effective implementation of the EU directive. What we focus on are all indicators related to energy communities intended as technical organizational innovation. But if we want to grasp the social innovation of the energy communities, we will need more and different information from other sources that we didn't consider in this exercise, but we intend to consider in the next future, such as social interaction, trust, and solidarity. As for the energy system, Italy has an electricity system still fossil fuel based with a high dependence from the abroad, but we can count on quite a long and well-established history and tradition in terms of social participation and cooperation in the energy field. As for the institutional landscape, even if we don't have yet implemented the EU directives, we can count on a temporary transposition. So finally, to successfully implement the energy community model, for sure in Italy, we will need to renew the current energy system towards renewables, a higher renewable share, and more modern infrastructures. We will need to reorganize the administrative procedures that are always an issue in Italy. We need to promote cooperation between policymakers, stakeholders, and to encourage private-public partnership to avoid to be too much dependent on public funds. And we will need to shift citizen education in general and their awareness about energy issue and the role that they can play in the energy field. And that's all. Thanks for your attention, and for any further information, this is my email.
Thank you so much, Alessandro, for your topic. I don't have seen questions in the chat, so I will repeat. If you have questions for the speakers, please place them in the chat on Wova, because this is the moment the speakers are live at the session. So ask your questions. By myself, I have two little questions, Alessandro. You spoke about voluntarily. Voluntarily. Do you think it is possible to achieve a zero carbon society only on voluntarily, or do you think legislation will come abroad, and when?
Well, thanks for asking. The voluntarity that I mentioned in the presentation was just referred to the energy communities initiative. I mean, to be an energy communities, the participation, the decision of getting in or getting out from the community has to be left totally free and in charge of people to be decided. This is just so constrained to the domain of the energy communities, as they are also implementing and foreseen by the EU directives. Widening the topic to the energy transition and to the zero carbon energy system. Well, of course, it would be great if we would be able just voluntarily, jointly to go towards this ambitious target. But of course, I mean, given the state of the art, given the sensitivity of people towards sustainability and energy issues, given the motivation of people to be engaged in changing their behavior, we cannot count on the simple willingness of people of doing something different. We need more than regulation. We will need right policies to steer people in changing their behavior, more, let's say, nudge inspired.
Thank you. Next question. Thank you for the talk. It's very interesting. So it's a compliment. So is it possible for you to set the institutional framework so that less advantaged regions would also benefit from the others?
Okay, now I'm reading now. Sorry. It's possible to set the institutional first of that less advantaged region could also benefit. But this is this could be the challenge. That so the idea is, if I well understood the questions, I can see a point in the fact that so if we want to be inspired by a cohesion approach to the implementation of the energy communities and energy policy, for sure, in the transposition of the EU directive at the national and regional level, we should take into account the difference, territorial difference within a country. So I don't know if it's a good idea to, if this is the question, to adapt the policy for eceee implementation in order to help more some disadvantaged regions instead of having equal distribution of resources in the whole country. For sure, the implementation should take into account the difference, and I think the transposition is a good opportunity. But I don't know, honestly, what kind of policies to be implemented in order for the disadvantaged regions to be benefited more than the others. I mean, I don't know how this territorial gap is something to be discussed. The second?
Okay, yes. Maybe you can discuss in the chat with this person and discuss further on. Alessandro, what do you see as the main challenges of assessing more countries using this framework?
Not any major challenge. Of course, there is always an issue in collecting data, but we used institutional secondary data that should be available in all the countries in Europe. And so I can't see any specific challenge.
So I will pick one more question and leave the last question again for Marcus. Alessandro, is the long-term end goal to connect energy communities in different countries? Is this feasible, desirable, and efficient?
So end goal to connect energy communities in different countries. What I don't know what what do you mean by connecting energy communities in different countries? So connecting energy communities across boundaries, connection among networks of energy communities. Well, for sure, given that at the moment the energy communities, as foreseen by the EU directives, are really small and are not able individually to play a role, for sure, if they cannot grow in scale, they need to federate and to build a network. I don't know if national or international, but for sure the network is important.
So I suggest for who asked the question to clarify more in the chat and have a nice chat with Alessandro. And now I ask Marcus, is there one last question you could pose to Alessandro?
There are some questions, but I think we have to move to the next speaker to stay in time. So I would ask you, Alessandro, just please go into the chat and yeah, maybe ask the questions there.
Okay.
So thank you so much, Alessandro. Thank you, Marcus. And now we go to Germany to your colleague, Sven Alsheimer, who is also a researcher at the Fraunhofer Institute. He wrote a paper, how German municipalities as pathmakers for a sustainable future are they leaders or followers? And Sven, are they leaders or followers?
They are both. But yeah, as you will see in the presentation, they also act as leaders in the in German climate action.
So you have the floor.
Hello and welcome to this presentation, where I'm going to present the paper that I've written with Elisabeth Dütschke and Heike Brugger, both also working at the Fraunhofer Institute for Systems and Innovation Research. The title of our paper is German Municipalities as Pathmakers for a Sustainable Future, Leaders or Followers. And what we analyzed in our paper is the perceived role of the municipalities in regards to climate action, as well as their interactions with actors outside the municipal administration. Now, looking into the agenda of this presentation, first I want to give you some background information, and I will talk about the possible roles of municipalities in climate action. After that, I will look further into the research goals and the data and methods, and also I'm going to present to you the key results, and I will conclude with the key findings of our study. Starting with the relevant background information, the 21st century has been called the century of the cities, which emphasizes the role that a local level can take in sustainability transitions and also the reduction of climate change. The importance of the municipal level is shown in different points. For example, they take a key role in making the link between individual actors on the one hand and higher political levels. Also, the local level is the place where the implementation of measures to meet climate change are executed, and municipalities also have a strong influence in shaping the local context. So you see the importance of the municipal level on the one hand, and challenges for the municipal level are that they have a lack of legislative power in comparison to subordinate levels, and often they also have limited resources. So you've seen the importance and also the key challenges for municipalities in climate action, but what are the possible roles that they can take here? And here I want to present to you 6 possible roles, which we took from the literature and combined in our concept here. And the first one I want to start with is the role as a consumer. By consuming goods and services in a climate-friendly way, the municipalities can trigger the demand for sustainable innovations, so they can do this by climate-friendly procurement measures. And by doing this, they can also act as a role model, and they can lead by example for other actors to follow them. They can also act as networkers and information brokers, so they can support the exchange between different actors on the local level. And also they can act as local leaders through strategic governance, through action plans, and so forth. Also, they can regulate in a way in the local context. In Germany, for example, they are responsible for public administration and also public services, which are referred to under the term of Daseinsvorsorge. And they can also provide information and services. They can consult other actors, and they provide services such as car sharing, for example. Now, looking further into the research goals of our study, here we had two main goals. First being that we wanted to analyze the roles of municipalities in climate action. And here we looked further into the municipalities' self-perception of the role, as well as their perceived role in relation to higher levels of government. Second research aim was that we wanted to analyze the interactions with actors outside the municipal administration. The databases for our study were in-depth interviews and a municipal survey. Starting with the interviews, they were semi-structured based on an interview guideline, and we wanted to include information-rich cases, so mainly municipalities with high levels of engagement in the field of climate action. We had 17 participants, 13 of them being representatives from cities, 4 others were other experts on municipal climate action. We contrasted our interviews with the results of a municipal survey on municipal climate action. Here, our addressees were German municipalities with 5,000 to 500,000 inhabitants. And we had a response rate of 31%. So we had 554 participants in total. As you can have seen in the last slide, we used the mixed methods approach. So we combined qualitative data, being the interviews, with quantitative data, the survey. And for the analysis of the qualitative data, for the analysis of the interviews, we applied content analysis to the interview transcripts. And in the table down below, you see the codes that we applied. And the main codes, they resemble the key research goals of our study. For the quantitative data, we mainly use descriptive statistics. And we also connected the questionnaire with structural data to do some bivariate statistics, correlation analysis, mainly with the number of inhabitants. Looking into the results of our paper, one of the key findings was that 48% of the municipalities rated the level of engagement in the field of climate action high or rather high, and many others in the midfield. So only few show limited engagement here. So the municipal climate action is actually of high importance to the municipalities, and they are quite active here. But what we want to focus on is not their engagement, but more their perceived roles. And here, our findings are that the most dominant role of the municipalities is being a role model. We can see this by looking into the survey results presented in the figure here on the right-hand side. Here you see the perceived realization of municipal roles in climate action. The white colors resemble a strong realization, and the more brown and more green colors are little realization. And the role model is in the top because here many of them perceive it to be strongly realized, while others show more or feature more mixed results. For example, if you look into the role as a consumer, many only think that it's partly realized in their municipality. And when we combine our survey findings with our interview findings, we see that this can be connected to some positives and negatives connected to this role. On the one hand side, it's seen as a simple and direct measure, and the municipalities think that they can lead by example by applying a consumer role. On the other hand side, we have high costs for climate-friendly procurement measures, and also the municipalities say that they lack the personal capacities. Regarding the role as a networker, many strongly realized this role, others little. So here is a dichotomy in the survey results. This can be partly attributed to larger municipalities embracing this role more than smaller ones. When we look into the regulator and the local leader role, these are somehow interconnected. So some municipalities consider the means of binding regulations to be very important instruments, and they highlighted this also in the interviews. Others, on the other hand, favor to lead by example instead, or by offering financial incentives, or by acting as a local leader. So when we look at the roles overall, we see that while enacting one role, the municipality is often also exercising another one simultaneously, so they are all somehow interconnected in some ways. When we look into the roles in relation to higher levels of government, we see that the majority of the municipalities claim to be able to make a significant independent contribution to climate action. And they also further stated that they should act as a leader in regards to climate action, since higher levels are not committed enough. But the results also show that many also think that more committed action by higher level actors is needed for activities to be feasible. So on the one hand side, they say they can have significant independent contribution. On the other hand, more committed action by higher level actors is needed. And why is that so? The higher levels of government, as our interview results show, have a central role in municipal climate action. They provide funding, and also they provide a regulatory framework, which is highlighted as very important in the interviews. The municipalities also partly orient themselves towards international or national targets, and the higher level goals are also referred to in order to legitimize their own action. So here we see that they look at the international and national targets, but the implementation of the targets is not perceived as the central task. It's more a voluntary action, not a mandatory one. And when we look into the actions with actors outside the municipal administration, we also see that the higher levels actors are not their most frequent exchange partners. Here, the primary exchange partners are actors from civil society, which are perceived as key initiators of local climate actions. And the perceived frequency is shown in the figure down below, where you see that the civil society is in the top. So here, the most frequent exchange takes place. And when we look at the bottom of the figure, we see that the European Commission and the United Nations, but also the federal government, so these higher level actors, here the municipalities are often only seldom or never in exchange with those actors. So they are the least frequent exchange partners. And here we have to say that when we look into the interview results, we see that this exchange sometimes happens indirectly by participating in climate protection networks, for example. So these take a very important role here. And also the institutionalized interaction, for example, with the federal government within funding programs is mentioned here. When we look at the local economy, we see that a lot of municipalities highlighted that it's important to get in contact with the local companies, because the municipalities themselves have limited influence on the climate action measures in the commercial sector. However, persuading the companies to engage in climate action is viewed as difficult. So when we now coming to the conclusion, when we look at the results of our study, they show that the municipalities, they combine various different approaches in contributing to climate change mitigation. And also municipal administrations are in active exchange with citizens in other municipalities. So there are these actors which they are in active exchange to. In regards to higher levels of government, interactions are more limited. But here, the municipal networks come into play, which are important for their indirect exchange, which is done through these networks. And overall, we see that climate action is an important issue for German municipalities. And also municipalities tend to be able to make a significant contribution themselves to the climate action. But when we look into the levels of engagement of municipalities, here further research should also examine the impact that local framework conditions can have on their different levels of engagement in climate action. Our study could not do this or did not focus on this in detail. So thank you for listening. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask. And I look forward to seeing you in the discussion.
Thank you very much, Sven, for the very interesting topic you mentioned. We don't have much time, so we only pick one or two questions, and please answer briefly. First question, do you see municipalities as entrepreneurs together with citizens and local companies in local climate corporations?
So cities as entrepreneurs, yeah, actually, what we also saw in the interviews is that cities can promote through funding and can promote like innovative ideas in climate action, and also they can network and create networks of innovative actors. So this may be how they can act as entrepreneurs in this field of climate action.
One briefly question, do you have any idea of how well the German municipalities are EU representative? Would maybe the result also be valid in France or Sweden or Latvia and so on?
Yeah, so actually, as this is as we interviewed and surveyed municipalities from Germany, it's specific to this context. So we have this limitation here when we want to transfer the results to other countries. But although this is the case, it is also possible to draw on some of the results. But you have to take the regulatory framework of the cities you have them in mind, because in Germany the municipalities have quite a lot of responsibilities, and in other countries this might be the case in a lesser way.
Do you have an idea, Sven, about the size of municipalities? Do you think how many people must be in a municipality so that it's big enough to function on this matter?
So actually, when we looked at our survey results in regards to the level of engagement in climate action, the size of the municipality, there was no correlation there. So actually, which was quite fascinating to us, that the size was not the most relevant factor. So maybe other framework conditions play a role here. And this is why I mentioned the further research in this respect. Yeah.
Thank you. Marcus, do you have one last question for your colleague?
We have a lot of questions in the chat, so maybe Sven, you can also go in the chat. But yeah, maybe one last question, whether leader or follower, what is the most important thing that all municipalities should do to increase effectiveness as pathmakers for a sustainable future?
Yeah, so we saw that that in our interviews, most of the more engaged municipalities, they combined a lot of the roles that we proposed. So we had a combination of many different aspects should be done, in my opinion, but also they should also focus on the local other actors and get an interaction here. If this is a short answer, maybe.
Okay, thank you so much. As now it is 12 o'clock, I suppose we have to close this session. Thank you all the speakers for the contribution. Thank you, Marcus, for the big help. And thank you to Carol for doing this with us together. See you back in the next session of panel 5, then with Marcus as your chairman tomorrow. So thank you so much and see you next time. I suppose the authors and the speakers will answer the questions that are still left in the chat. You can still ask questions and have a nice day. Thank you so much and see you.